Good morning, everybody. Such a terrible way to start that. Excuse me. Sorry about that. We're so delighted that you're all here with us. I wanted to just make a few announcements to remind everybody of some things and to clarify a few things. So do please remember that we will not meet next week for the lecture on the 2nd. And then on the 9th, we will not have this program, but we will have a medieval symposium that day. And that's a symposium that's stocked with medieval scholars, and that's being put together by our Mellon Curatorial Fellow, Amanda Dotseth. That program, so everybody's clear, starts actually the night before on the 8th with a keynote lecture at 6 o'clock, our usual lecture time, by Julian Raby, who's the former director of the Freer Sackler, who will be talking about Islamica in medieval treasuries in Spain. And then the next day is a program that runs from 10:30 in the morning until 4:30 in the afternoon of all sorts of different entry points from medieval Spanish art. So I hope you will join us for that program. And then we will finally see Rebecca back on the 16th of March, which is interesting because it mirrors this date, and then we'll finish up on the 23rd of March, correct? Okay, so I wanted to make sure and remind everybody of that. So I have a really important thing to tell you all, and so you know you've called, and you kept telling us you've called, and we were like, we didn't get your call, and we were having trouble with that for a long time. Last week during the lecture, Jennifer Aprea finally figured out what was going on by calling someone else that could actually help us on campus. Your calls that were coming during the daytime were going to, y'all probably don't realize, but all of our phone calls now go to emails. So when we get a voicemail, it really is an email message, and it was going to some email that we were not connected to in any way since last February. Jennifer found over 800 RSVPs in that mailbox. The problem is fixed, so I'm prayerful that going forward we will not have that issue any longer, but I do really apologize as we all work through our kinks and the kinks in the university system, and I do apologize for any inconvenience that this has caused. Finally, the last thing is we did stop serving coffee before this lecture series because that was a specially funded part of our program that was separate from even the lecture funding. And so we did receive funding for this lecture series a few years ago that was promoted by, of course, our founder's name, Luis Martin, of course. And in order to make sure that our funds in the lecture budget continue forward, I can't just keep pulling that money. And we had not had funding for quite some time. So I apologize there's no coffee. I hope you all will find a way to congregate beforehand for coffee somewhere and then come join us at 10:30. But please understand, and please understand my poor interns at the front don't have any control over that either. So if you do need to talk to me about the coffee, I can talk to you about the coffee, but there's not much I can do about the coffee. We are so glad you're all here. Last week's lecture was fantastic, and I'm sure this week's lecture will be as well. And I'm now going to shut up and turn it over to Rebecca.
Okay, thank you, Scott. Can everyone hear me, including those in the back? Okay. And then lights, are we going to dim? You can't look at beautiful art with the lights fully on in the house. Today is actually a subject that's very dear to my heart. You probably don't remember, is that too loud? No, it's good? Okay. Okay, great. You probably don't remember, but my dissertation is about the Immaculate Conception. So it's taken a great deal of restraint not to go too crazy for today's lecture. But if you want to talk more about the Immaculate Conception anytime, I would be happy to do so. So last week you remember that we saw Murillo's scenes of children and genre scenes. We know he would have drawn inspiration for these from daily life in Seville, and we're increasingly seeing that Murillo as an artist is completely inseparable from the city of Seville, and we'll see that even more today. And today we're going to be looking at his treatment of specifically civilian subjects. I've put these up here because there's nothing perhaps almost nothing as quintessentially civilian as the saints, the patron saints of Seville, Justa and Rufina, who we have upstairs and are very famous and just very beautiful. And I hope we'll get time to look at these a little more closely in our last lecture. But more specifically, today we'll be talking about Murillo's engagement with the most important theopolitical initiatives of the 17th century, both of which Seville was the epicenter of. And that is, of course, the campaign to define the Immaculate Conception as dogma, and the canonization campaign for San Fernando, who was a Castilian king and Reconquista hero. There is no doubt, again, that Murillo was a painter of his city, but also no doubt that he was a painter of his time. Examining his involvement in these two fevered efforts, and always, of course, remembering that we're in the midst of a city in decline, as we have discussed many times so far in this lecture series, and in previous lecture series, I think Professor Jasinski also quite amply covered the fact that Seville was a city in decline in the 17th century. But this will give us an opportunity to explore the texture of religious life in Golden Age Seville, which was full of pageantry, pomp, circumstance, festival, and also full of controversy. But also will let us take seriously the persuasive potential of images and the very great power images and those who made them could wield. Images took on a protagonistic role in both of these debates. And in both episodes, we see the supporters of the Immaculate Conception and of the canonization campaign for San Fernando winning victories in the 17th century, but ultimately incomplete victories. The Immaculate Conception was not defined as dogma until 1854, and San Fernando, although his cult was extended in the 17th century, never won official canonization. So poor Seville is disappointed yet again, despite the best efforts of artists like Murillo and his compatriots. So any student of Spanish history could tell you that piety and politics are intertwined in Spain in a unique way. And there's a complete permeability between religion and politics. Those are the two subjects that polite society today would tell us to avoid at dinner conversation. But they're absolutely at the front of culture in Spain in general, but in particular in Seville. And here we see, I've just chosen this as an illustration of the phenomenon of the support for the Immaculate Conception in 17th century Spain. And this is an image of King Philip IV swearing an oath to defend the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception. And it was a very, it was a belief very close to the heart of the Habsburgs ever since, well, and even the Trastámaras, ever since the days of Isabel and Ferdinand. But by the 17th century, and with Philip III, it became state policy. Support of the Immaculate Conception became increasingly intertwined with Spanish identity. It was the most hotly contested issue of the 17th century, and it came in the years just before Murillo's birth, the controversy came to a head. Who's ever gone to confession in Spain or tried to enter a monastery in Spain? Any of you? You know, the priest or the nun behind the door. And this is something we're taught in grad school by a very famous Hispanist, Richard Kagan. One of the first things he'll tell you is that if you're trying to go to an archive that's controlled by nuns or monks, even if you're not religious, you have to know how do you respond when they say Ave Maria Purissima? What do you say? Exactly. Well, that's the Hail Mary, but sin pecado concebida is how you respond. And what you're really saying is, I support the Immaculate Conception too. And it's kind of this secret password that gets you where you need to go, or it helps you start off a confession, I suppose. But I just wanted to illustrate that even today, the Immaculate Conception is interwoven into the fabric of Spanish identity and everyday life. And indeed, I wanted to bring in this. Oh, no. I wonder how I can make it. I want this to play, not. Oh boy. Okay, technological glitches. You're just going to have to bear with me. No. Okay. Now, and we're going to have to do this a couple times because I have a couple videos, so bear with me. And the internet is probably slow in this building, but it'll be worth it. The point is, oh, and you can't hear sound? I guess I should have. Can you hear from my computer? I think it'll be okay. Okay, so these are people connected with.
You'll be able to now.
I'll be able to now. These are individuals connected with the University of Seville, and on the eve of the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, every year since the 50s, groups of the facultades, the departments, the various departments in the university, convene to sing tunas to the Immaculate Conception. So these traditions seem strange from an outsider's perspective, but then when you think about odd university traditions we have here in the US, this is nothing compared to the strange things that we do. But yes, so groups convene around this monument to the Immaculate Conception and to sing to the Virgin. And it's all after midnight, of course, which is fine when you're in Seville, but would never fly here. The monument around which they sing was erected in 1917 in memory of the city's defense of the contested doctrine of the Immaculate Conception, which, as I've mentioned, was not defined as dogma until 1854. And this is a very triumphal monument, and indeed the plaza in which it's located is called the Plaza de Triunfo, so it's the Plaza of Triumph. And it celebrates the local heroes who fought most valiantly to defend the Virgin. And as you might imagine, there were a lot of civilians who fought valiantly in the 17th century to defend the Virgin. But for purposes of space, they could only pick 4. And who did they pick? They picked Juan de Pineda and Miguel Cid, who were a theologian and a poet. But more importantly for our purposes, they picked 2 artists, the sculptor Martinez Montañez, and then, of course, our friend Murillo. This tells us 2 things. First, that the triumph was ultimately just as much a victory for artists as it was for theologians, but also that of all the city's painters who contributed images of the Immaculate Conception, and there were many, I assure you, Murillo was remembered as the most important one. And this is for good reason, which I hope you'll see very shortly. Stirring up your interest in these images might take some work. These images, even though I find them fascinating, and I hope you will too by the end of the lecture, if you don't know much about the context, you might find them a little bit stale or boring. They're often taken for granted as pretty but uncomplicated manifestations of Counter-Reformation Marian fervor, but they are much more complex, as we will see. So before we go any further, what is the Immaculate Conception? Many people confuse it with the Incarnation. The Immaculate Conception, the Incarnation is often portrayed in art with the Annunciation, where we see, I've chosen one of my very favorite Northern Renaissance altarpiece panels in which you see the angel Gabriel appearing to the Virgin Mary to announce her pregnancy. And the most fun part, of course, is this little baby Jesus who comes through the window here. And just to give you an idea of how one might have a virgin pregnancy and a virgin birth. And this is also playing with the theme of the unbroken glass, which, as you might imagine, light can go pass through glass without breaking it, and this, since the medieval period, is a metaphor for the incarnation of Jesus, how his mother was able to be a virgin but yet give birth. But that is not the Immaculate Conception. And I never thought that my dissertation topic would be relevant on CNN, but it was very recently. And I just want a disclaimer, this is not supposed to be political at all. I just think this is quite fun. There's a congressman who's gotten himself into a pickle by using the Immaculate Conception as a metaphor, but it unfolds that he doesn't know what he's talking about. And let's see. You're gonna have to suspend your disbelief for a second while I.
What do you mean by the Immaculate Conception? That's the substance of. Look, I was making a point that this is an absurd coincidence.
By what? Like, what do you think happened with the Immaculate Conception?
The Immaculate Conception, it's obviously a religious doctrine. It deals with the Christian faith.
I know, but I'm saying, like, where is the analogy? That's what I don't understand. What do you think happened with the Immaculate Conception?
Look, did you really bring me on to discuss my religious views, Chris?
No, I'm saying you made the analogy.
Jesus was born.
I don't understand. The Immaculate Conception is not how Jesus was born.
Oh.
It was the conception. That's the nature of the Immaculate.
It was Mary's conception. It was the mother's conception without original sin. It was not the conception of Jesus. Facts matter.
I'm glad you enjoyed that as much as I did. And you can tell, I think that's Chris Cuomo. He must, with a name like Cuomo, he must have gone to Catholic school, or at least to catechism on the weekends to be able to school the congressman that much. It's painful to watch, but it shows you. Well, I think he actually did quite a good job of explaining the Immaculate Conception, that Mary was conceived without the stain of original sin, the sin of Adam and Eve, right? And this is, of course, from the first instance of her conception. This was hotly debated since the Middle Ages, particularly Thomas Aquinas is the most famous opponent of the Immaculate Conception, and with him go the Dominicans. But it came to a head, the debate came to a head in 17th century Spain. But for our purposes, what's most interesting is the artist's approach to portraying the Immaculate Conception. How do you portray a conception, particularly in the 17th century when you don't understand much about the biology behind how a conception actually occurs? And some of the theories are pretty nuts. But how would you portray a conception, much less a stainless one without the stain of original sin? For that matter, how can you portray an event that occurred outside of time? And that's a very important part of the theology behind the Immaculate Conception, is that before time, outside of time, Mary was sinless, which is hard to wrap your head around. And without getting too bogged down in the details and at the risk of oversimplifying, Golden Age Spanish artists settled on a relatively simple solution for a very complex and esoteric theological argument, borrowing from other Marian iconographies and settling on the image with which we are all familiar. The choice for this very simple image, which would become iconic, and indeed most Spaniards could tell you what an Immaculate Conception looks like, even if, like the congressman, they might be a little fuzzy on the details. But the simplicity of this image was actually a brilliant PR move on behalf of the Immaculists and the artists who were portraying the Immaculate Conception. And we don't have time to get into it too much, but the debate became essentially a war in the streets, which came to a head in 1615. And as I said, the main opponents were Dominicans, and the supporters were mainly the Franciscans and the Jesuits. And if you can imagine how heated the 2016 election was, multiply that by 10, and that's the debate over the Immaculate Conception. Neither side wants to hear the other's perspective, and even the kids are roped into it. This is Miguel Cid, who was on that monument from earlier, and he's a poet. He writes what are called the coplas, like the little couplet songs. This is a pamphlet that was distributed widely, and the song, which you were supposed to teach to children, they would sing it in the streets at all hours. And even there's records of some religious orders plying these children with candy to get them to sing the coplas in favor of the Immaculate Conception. And then the Dominicans got wise to the idea and came up with their own counter song and got other children, I'm sure probably the same children, if we think about the kids we saw last week, they probably would have sung either way to get the candy. But in any case, this really obscure religious doctrine became something that came up in almost every context. We even know that at Velázquez's wedding banquet, a big debate broke out over the Immaculate Conception. So again, my reference to the 2016 election might give you an idea of the heatedness of support or of supporting or being against the Immaculate Conception in this period. But what the Immaculists had, and this is what's important for art history, what the Immaculists had that the Maculists didn't, and an Immaculist obviously is a supporter of the Immaculate Conception, and a Maculist is one who says, no, her conception was not free from original sin. The Immaculists could use images. And I think that this is very savvy on their part and helped them win in the end, is that they were able to rely on images, whereas the Maculists had no nothing to counter this flood, this multimedia explosion of Immaculist images with. And where did the iconography for the Immaculate Conception come from? By the time Murillo was born, the iconographic formula had been well solidified, although there were variants and different approaches, particularly in the 16th century. By Murillo's birth, this is pretty much what you see. And this is, of course, the Juan de Sevilla Immaculate Conception from upstairs. And the image comes from scriptural sources, particularly from the woman of the Apocalypse that we see in Revelation 12. And a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. And this is from the Apocalypse. It's a very simple and iconic image. In colonial painting, in earlier painting and then in later colonial painting, you see them really going overboard trying to explain the Immaculate Conception. This is from the DMA, and it's a fabulous image. So they're trying to be very didactic here, right? The artist is trying to be very didactic and say, here's the Virgin, you've got the elements that you see in the other Immaculate Conceptions, but then you've got her parents, right? Because it's a conception. So we don't want to miss that. You've also got original sin here with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and the snake. But then you've also got the dragon that appears in the Revelation chapter. So they're really covering all bases to try to explain what's going on. I think the civilian artists had it a little bit better. So as I said, scriptural sources informed the iconography of these images, and who better to tell us how to paint an Immaculate Conception than Francisco Pacheco, who, as you might know, is the greatest art theorist of 17th century Spain and Velázquez's father-in-law and teacher, in which case the student really did outpace the teacher from very early on. He was a little bit better theorist than a painter, but these are two of his Immaculate Conceptions, so we're going to look at a passage from his Art of Painting treatise, and we're going to see how he tells you to paint them alongside images of how he painted them. Okay, in this loveliest of mysteries, Our Lady should be painted as a beautiful young girl, 12 or 13 years old, in the flower of her youth. She should be pretty, or she should have pretty but serious eyes with perfect features and rosy cheeks and the most beautiful long golden locks. In short, she should be as beautiful as a painter's brush can make her. She should be painted wearing a white tunic and a blue mantle. She is surrounded by the sun, an oval of sun of white and ochre, which sweetly blends into the sky. So the woman clothed in the sun from Revelation, you see she's clothed in the sun. And you'll notice that in all Immaculate Conceptions now, I hope. Rays of light emanate from her head, around which is a ring of 12 stars. Again, that comes from the Revelation passage that we saw. An imperial crown adorns her head, without, however, hiding the stars. Under her feet is the moon. Although it is a solid globe, I take the liberty of making it transparent so that the landscape shows through. And Pacheco was also very insistent that you should paint the crescent going down so that you were aware that the moon was a solid globe, rather than thinking that when the moon is a crescent, where did the rest of the moon go? So that's an interest in science that we see there. In the upper part, and now I'm drawing from his other image, in the upper part of the painting, one usually puts God the Father or the Holy Spirit, or both, together with the already mentioned words of the husband. And so this is this very busy one where he's included God the Father and Jesus along with the Holy Spirit. The earthly attributes are placed suitably in the landscape. And what earthly attributes is he talking about? Well, they're all scriptural. We see over and over in these images of the Immaculate Conception, including in the one by Juan de Sevilla upstairs. You see the references to the city of God from Psalms here. You see reference to the gate of heaven from Genesis. Many elements from the Song of Solomon, the Tower of David. And in many of these paintings, it's painted as the Torre de Oro, which is a famous landmark in Seville. You often see a ship. The Virgin was considered the help of mariners. We also see elements from the Old Testament, the palm tree and the cypress, as well as the enclosed garden and the closed well. So that's where all of those little elements, they're supposed to subtly blend into the landscape, but then when you approach the painting with a critical eye, you're able to all of a sudden appreciate that all of this landscape is actually symbolic. The heavenly attributes can be placed, if you wish, among the clouds, and seraphim or angels can also hold some of the attributes. And we see him choosing to go the latter route here, with an angel here holding the mirror, an unspotted mirror, and then the flowers. The passage goes on, "It slipped my mind completely to mention the dragon, our common enemy, whose head the Virgin broke when she triumphed over original sin. In fact, I always forget him, because the truth is that I never willingly paint him and omit him whenever I can in order not to embarrass my picture with his presence." But we do see in this Rubens and in many other Immaculate Conceptions, particularly earlier ones, this is from the late 1620s. Rubens painted it while at Spanish court. She's, of course, stepping on the dragon, defeating original sin. But painters are free to improve upon everything I have said. And I think that Murillo really did improve, and he became the master of the Immaculate Conception. So why was this? I think it's both a question of technique. His late exquisite vaporous style was particularly suited to portraying such a heavenly scene. There's almost nothing earthly about the way Murillo paints at the end of his career, and indeed most of his Immaculate Conceptions are done towards the end of his career. But also because of the simplicity of his images. In most cases, he gets rid of the extraneous detail. So all of this is gone, and all you're left with is the Virgin and some angels. And when he does include elements referencing her heavenly and earthly attributes, they're very subtly incorporated. This is, I think, proves that he's quite the rhetorician when it comes to visual rhetoric. Unlike Pacheco and others before him, he understood that arguing for the Immaculate Conception wasn't about explaining the doctrine. The doctrine the theology behind it is so complex and arcane that none of that mattered when you really came down to it. It was about making the image so iconic and ubiquitous that it became its own argument, so emotionally appealing that belief in the doctrine becomes a gut feeling. And indeed, I think Murillo is a master of emotional appeal, as we've seen so far and as we'll continue to see as we study his work further. He painted so many Immaculate Conceptions, dozens. I tried to make a slide that had all of his Immaculate Conceptions on them, and it crashed my PowerPoint because the images were so high resolution. But I gave up on that idea. But he painted so many that he's even remembered for this in Romantic 19th century painting. When you think of the Immaculate Conception in Spanish art, you think of Murillo. The two are synonymous. We would need an entire lecture series, though, to cover all of Murillo's Immaculate Conceptions. So today we're just going to look at four. His three most important ones, and then we'll also be looking at the one here upstairs, because it's upstairs and it's the one that we get to see in person, but also because it's his second earliest treatment of the subject. So it actually does figure importantly into his development as an artist and his development as a painter of the Immaculate Conception. We'll be looking at the La Colossal, which we saw in the Romantic painting here. It's the same as this one. It's a very iconic image. It's his first treatment of the subject. We'll also be looking at the one from the Meadows, the one from Aranjuez, and the Su Madonna. And if we have time during the Q&A, I brought slides with more of his Immaculate Conceptions if you happen to be curious to see more. So we'll start with La Colossal. Both this and the Meadows canvas were painted before Murillo goes to Madrid. So this is before his brushwork loosens, before his palette softens, and we still see the firm contours that mark his earlier style. This is his first attempt at the subject that we know, and it was commissioned by the Franciscans, who, as I said, were the main supporters of the belief. And it's, of course, called La Colossal because it is colossal. It is absolutely huge. And it was painted to be hung very high in its original location. Now, if you see it at the Museo de Bellas Artes in Seville, you see it is huge, and they do, in fact, hang it high, which is how it's originally meant to be seen. And that explains his approach to the composition. It's absolutely monumental, and here she's standing on a full moon rather than the customary crescent. Now turning to the Meadows painting is also known, by the way, as the Loja conception because it was painted for the parish church of Loja in the province of Granada. It's the next earliest after La Colossal, and it tells us important things about Murillo's early style. He's not a kid, but he still hasn't gone to Madrid. And again, he goes to Madrid when he's 40, so he's a mature painter now, but he just hasn't hit his stride in terms of his late style quite yet. The Virgin here is very sweet and youthful. The image has been pared down to its elements. None of the symbols from the litanies are included, just the angels who gaze at the Virgin in devotion, and they're modeling, just like the children in his other paintings, they're modeling what our response as a devout viewer should be to this image of the Virgin. The only apocalyptic elements are the sun, which we see in the background, and of course the moon at her feet. And before you ask about triumph over Islam, which I've been asked this before, nothing to do with that. There's many instances of triumph over Islam in 17th century Spanish painting, but this is not one of them. The moon comes from the apocalypse, and that's why it is included. His precise handling of whites is my favorite part about this painting. They're just so luminous and crisp. Even though we're not yet in his mature style, I think that there's something to be said for this painting. And now we can appreciate it even better now that it's off the stairs and on the wall in the galleries upstairs. The contours are still a little bit rigid, still a little bit precise, and it lacks the vaporous, frothy quality of later works. But we know that the composition was absolutely carefully planned. A surviving sheet in the British Museum shows his preparation for the angels. You can see the little heads here line up precisely, and the pose of the angels, and you just see he's such a virtuoso when it comes to drawing. And we'll learn more about Murillo as a draftsman next week, or in 2 weeks, I should say. Then, if you recall, all the way from 2 weeks ago, his contributions for the renovation of the Church of Santa Maria la Blanca, that's also an Immaculist foundation. And we see him treating the subject here. And this is just, we've already discussed this, but I just wanted to give you a context of where in the timeline of his career we are. So now flashing forward well, I should mention, I suppose, that I mentioned it in passing when we talked about this church, but it was renovated in response to an Immaculate victory, right? Throughout the 17th century, they're trying to get the Immaculate Conception defined as dogma. And they realize that they have to settle on the via negativa, right? Getting it settled by having the opponents silenced. So a victory is won in 1661 in which the Pope issues essentially what was a gag order on anyone who opposed the Immaculate Conception. So they weren't allowed to publicly oppose the Immaculate Conception anymore, which in Seville was greeted with absolute exuberant joy and excitement. And in response, they renovated this church of Santa Maria la Blanca. And that's why we see the Immaculate Conception figuring so prominently into Murillo's decorative cycle. So flashing forward to this, which is probably his second most famous Virgin of the Immaculate Conception. It's called the Virgin of Aranjuez because it hung in the chapel of St. Anthony at the Royal Palace of Aranjuez until 1818. And his mature style here is in absolute full swing. The atmosphere it shimmers. You can see the way that the contours have completely dissolved and the textures are absolutely softened. And the elements have also been pared down, just the angels, and just a handful of angels here. And this work was absolutely beloved in the 19th century. It was described by an American doctor who was visiting the Prado in 1875, and I think the passage is worth reading. The Virgin stands enthroned on clouds, in loveliness of face and form, chaste and graceful drapery, and transcendent coloring. And indeed, in the 19th century, they loved Murillo's coloring. And I think we can see why when we look at the details. Atmosphere and infant angels, too, are brightness and beauty, the one golden-hued, the others lustrous and exultant, making the gazer feel as if he were quaffing gladness, and has flung on him sweetness of peace and purity, as palms, myrtles, lilies, and roses are waved and tossed abroad by the fluttering throng of innocence, while in recognition of divine purpose by the heavenward look, in transported sense and soul told alike by face of yearning and submission, and by the folded hands on the breast, there is seen the beautifully tender and gentle, trustful and rapturous, the sublimely spiritual. There's something about it so expressive of seraphic obedience, so much less of earth than heaven, in the pure and pious fervor of the face, something so marvelously happy, yet so humbly passive, in the folded hands, stilling the glad tumult of the heart. 19th century, what are you going to do? Something so exquisitely spiritual about this revelation that one lingers long at the art shrine, and the longer, the stronger he clings to blending lines and tints and tones which make a thing of truth and beauty. Presented as the Virgin here is, if a knowledge of the passion and its pangs was hers, she looked beyond them at the glory of God and the grace of his redemption. I think Dr. Baxley had a crush on the Virgin, and I think on Murillo too. And this is his most famous painting. This attracted the same type of response in the 19th century. And this is his most famous version. It was in the Louvre until the 40s when it was transferred back to the Prado. As I mentioned earlier, there was agreement between the Vichy government in France and Franco's government, and it was a diplomatic gesture in which the painting was returned to Spain. And actually, it was part of a trade. They traded a couple of other paintings in the Prado, and they already had the Virgin of Aranjuez in the Prado, so some critics at the time said, why are we trading other paintings for more virgins by Murillo? But it's his most famous treatment of the subject, so you can understand why. It was painted for a charitable foundation, and the patron was Justino de Neve, who's the same friend and patron of Murillo who spearheaded the renovation of Santa Maria la Blanca. This was done for the Hospital of the Venerables Sacerdotes, which are these retired priests in Seville, and it was a charitable foundation where they could go when they had retired. And this is his most important commission of the 1670s. The Virgin shimmers here too. You almost might describe her as incandescent. She's perfectly placed among this absolute riot of putti, which are these little angels, right? And her drapery is completely diaphanous. I love the way he's kind of cocked the crescent moon to the side. You almost might describe it as jaunty. And it's just full of bravado, I think, this painting. The most vivid blue imaginable is used for her cloak, and the hazy gold disappears into the evaporating clouds. You get this sensation of rapid ascension when you look at this image. There's so much movement upwards. It almost feels like an assumption, but we know that it's an Immaculate Conception. The fame of this painting, as I mentioned, lived on. And I should say Murillo, I think, was very proud of this image. This puto here has always kind of disturbed me. It's kind of strange when all of the other angels are absolutely idealized. This one, I think, looks like he must have been a Murillo. Either as a kind of an odd self-portrait as a puto, or maybe more likely a portrait of one of his 9 children, or I don't even know how many grandchildren he must have had. But the fame of this painting, as I said, lived on. It was the most popular painting in 19th century France. I'm sure you all followed the story of the recent sale of that Da Vinci, the Leonardo painting of the Salvator Mundi, which fetched the highest price ever at auction. Well, in the 19th century, this was that painting. It fetched the highest price ever taken at auction. And we'll talk a lot more about this in our last lecture when we talk about the romantic reception of Murillo. But it was not universally acclaimed, and just before you think that everyone in the 19th century was gaga over Murillo, I want to bring in a counterpoint. This is a French author. The great Spanish painter was certainly very learned in his art, but we may doubt whether he was so in the sense proper to that word when applied to Christian art. For ourselves, we can see nothing in the famous picture at the Louvre but a much too real figure, disorderly in dress and hair, and around which whirl a crowd of little naked infants, whose merry attitudes and games by no means harmonize with the solemnity of the august mystery which the artist wished to represent. That connoisseurs should fall into raptures at the magic of coloring of this great painter is quite right. But we believe that the simple religious worshippers would pay little attention to the picture if they were not told that it cost 600,000 francs. So why was Murillo, though, so successful at the Immaculate Conception, as the painter of the Immaculate Conception? I think key to understanding this is comparing him with what the other big painters, big names in Seville in the second half of the 17th century were doing. And to do so, I've brought in two paintings that were recently donated to the Prado. One by, well, that's Valdés Leal. I'm not sure what happened there with that caption. But anyway, as you just pretend that says Valdés Leal, and this is Murillo. So we see Valdés Leal tries to approximate the riot of cherubs used by Murillo, but I think he misses the mark here. And what's more, if Pacheco tells you that the Virgin should be as beautiful as the painter's brush can make her, that doesn't say very much for the painter's brush in the case of Valdés Leal. This is not a very beautiful Virgin, I think, particularly when you compare to Murillo. I think that Valdés Leal as a painter in general was much more suited to kind of sinister subjects, as we saw in his work for the Caridad, where he paints the skeletons quite perfectly, but sweet virgins and angels is not quite his cup of tea. And yes, there's just kind of an awkwardness. His compositions don't have that lyrical quality and that smoothness that you see in Murillo, and you almost don't realize how smooth Murillo actually is until you compare him to other painters. The other example is his other rival, Herrera el Mozo, and this caption is correct. And Herrera does a little bit better with the Immaculate Conception, but it's still a little bit flat and stilted. The Virgin almost looks bored, I would say, rather than completely enraptured. And he doesn't quite have the same fluidity here with his putti that we see in Murillo. Again, there's the bored Virgin of the Immaculate Conception. We can't give Murillo all the credit, though, for his approach to the Immaculate Conception. He was profoundly influenced by an Italian artist called Guido Reni, whose painting now hangs in the Met. But this painting was commissioned by the Spanish ambassador in Rome, and it's been argued that it was commissioned as a sort of like stick it to ya to the Pope at this period, who would refuse to give the Spanish any ground on the Immaculate Conception. So what the Spanish ambassador did was commission the Immaculate Conception from the Pope's favorite painter. So that's quite a diplomatic strategy. But it was painted and commissioned for one of the Spanish infantas, and then it was eventually, it hung in the Cathedral of Seville. And we can see that Murillo, as an artist, would have been profoundly influenced by seeing this canvas. Again, it's stripped down of all of the elements. There's no mirror, there's no enclosed garden, there's no tower, there's no city of God. It's just the Virgin in a rapturous pose with this golden haze behind her and just a few select putti. So why were images so important? I think I mentioned earlier that images were the best weapon in the Immaculist arsenal for this debate. But why did they matter so much? And I think that understanding this is crucial to understanding the way that religious art functioned in 17th century Spain. Part of the strategy to getting the Immaculate Conception defined as dogma was to prove that there was popular support for the cult, and that there had been for a very long time. This was a strategic move, and the stakes were very high for some of the supporters of the Immaculate Conception. In particular, there's one brotherhood of gentlemen who believed that the moment the Pope defined the Immaculate Conception as dogma, the apocalypse would be brought on. Now, we know from 1854 that didn't happen, so they were mistaken in that belief, but I think that just goes to underline how important this cause was to its fiercest supporters, particularly in southern Spain. Through claiming, and this is an image of the huge procession in which the estimated number of participants number in the 100,000 range in Seville in 1615, just 2 years before Murillo was born. And there's this clamorous procession. This painting is crucial to winning the king's support for the doctrine, and then from then on the Habsburgs would send money and images and lobbyists, essentially, to Rome to work on the definition of the Immaculate Conception. The role images played in this strategy was completely essential. And we have to remember this strategy when we turn in a moment to San Fernando. To close, yes, the Immaculate Conception is a very Spanish belief, and it's, of course, part of collective Spanish identity, as I hope I've demonstrated. And the Crown's defense of the Immaculate Conception was certainly a point of pride for the Habsburgs. But it was Seville that got the ball rolling, and that is even remembered today. And I should note that the painting is the inspiration behind the monument that we saw earlier in the lecture. And elements of Seville, and this is from upstairs, are even included in a lot of these paintings. So it was a point of pride for civilians, even to the 20th century. So I hope that you don't, next time you see an Immaculate Conception, you don't just think of it as a sweet manifestation of counter-Reformation Marian fervor, but rather a carefully constructed tool of persuasion and perils of having hair. Can you hear me still? Has it died? Hello? No. This one on? Hello? Well, anyway. Okay. Okay, oh, yes, perfect. Okay, so it's a carefully constructed tool of persuasion in a hotly contested debate that defined the times. And to close, I have one more video I want to show you. And this is my favorite. It's a pop song from the 80s, and only people from Seville know what this is. And I've tried other Spaniards, and they don't know who Silvio y Sacramento is. But yes, this is a song called Swing Maria. So that's going to get stuck in your head because it gets stuck in mine. But what I want you to notice is that he says, in the beginning lyric, he says, María es la pura concepción que antes Roma, Sevilla proclamó, right? We were more Catholic than even Rome. Seville was, at the cutting edge of Immaculate belief, even when all of you other fools didn't support us. So that is the Immaculate Conception in Seville. Now we turn to another very civilian topic for which Murillo was intimately involved, and that is the campaign to canonize San Fernando. And of course, you see even San Fernando. He appears in the coat of arms of Seville. And we see that here on the monument that's become so essential to today's lecture. We see King San Fernando there, surrounded by Archbishops Isidore and Leander, who are the other most famous cultural icons of Seville. So, San Fernando was a medieval Castilian king and Reconquista hero. He's most famous for recapturing important Andalusian cities. He recaptured Cordoba in 1236. And more important for our purposes, Seville in 1248. And he pushed the map of Al-Andalus to Granada, where it would remain for over 200 years, essentially, with just a few changes. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with the history of the Reconquest, but Saint Ferdinand, or King Ferdinand III of Castile, was a very important figure. He comes just after Navas de Tolosa, which is one of the most important Reconquest battles. And we'll hear more about San Fernando and the Reconquest, I'm sure, in the medieval symposium that Scott mentioned in 2 weeks. But he was a favorite son of Seville, and we see Sevillian painters, even much before Murillo, such as Pacheco here, depicting San Fernando. And this is the Muslim rulers of Seville handing over the keys on this golden plate. And who else do we see but the Virgin? The Virgin of the Kings, one of the most famous images from the Cathedral of Seville. So San Fernando, we also might remember him because he's the father of Alfonso X the Wise, who's a name that might be familiar to you. A resurgence in interest in this saint occurred in the mid-17th century, and a renewed campaign to have him officially recognized as a saint or canonized by the Catholic Church has been convincingly attributed to an effort to combat decline and court divine favor. And this aim is reflected in contemporary sermons. And this is the argument of Amanda Wunder, who wrote that book about Baroque Seville that was just published that I included in the reading list given to you on the first day. So if you want to learn more about San Fernando, Amanda Wunder is the place to go. You might remember San Fernando from a recent exhibition at the Meadows upstairs on the festival book that was printed in celebration of the festivities after his cult was extended in 1671. So the idea behind the canonization campaign was that if the city could pool together its resources and lobby for the successful canonization of the saint, maybe the tides would turn for Seville. Maybe God would look on them with favor again if they could get Saint Ferdinand canonized. And here I've included a print by a French artist that was influential on Counter-Reformation images of the saint, especially in Spain, though he was never officially canonized. And this is a recurrent mistake that you see over and over repeated in the scholarship. He was never officially canonized, but the canonization process, particularly in the Counter-Reformation, was increasingly policed and very difficult. So he did win the cult did win incremental victories over the course of the 17th century, largely due to the efforts of those in Seville. And one of those victories, the most important one, was in 1671 when his cult was extended throughout the territories of the Spanish crown. And when this news reached Seville, it was like, imagine what happened in Philadelphia after they won the Super Bowl. There weren't cars to tip over in Baroque Seville, but if there were, they would have been tipped over because people were that excited about St. Ferdinand's cult being extended. And over the course of 5 days in May of 1671, the city threw the most extravagant religious festival ever held in Baroque Spain, which transformed the cathedral and city streets with ephemeral architecture. Absolutely no expense was spared. There were dances, fireworks, processions, and all sorts of decorations. And to make these decorations, all of the major artists in the city, including Valdés Leal and of course our friend Murillo, were called in to help. And this elaborate event, as I said, was recorded in the festival book by Torre Farfán, published that same year. and the prints in the book mark the most important example of Baroque Spanish graphic art. In it, we see images of the Giralda, which was decorated and festooned with all sorts of streamers. And by the way, this is from the coronation of King Philip just a couple of years ago, so it might give you an idea of what it looked like. But we also see ephemeral altarpieces were built, and this is one that was designed by Murillo. And you can see how elaborate and costly these decorations were. The most costly and elaborate decoration was what was called the Triunfo, which was the most important monument in the fiestas, and it measured over 134 feet tall and was designed by Valdés Leal. And the clouds and putti that we see up at the top, and by the way, all these prints are from the Meadows permanent collection. The clouds and putti were actually there. This was like a masterpiece of not only religion, but also of theater. And we know that during the festival, flowers were tossed from the top of this thing down into the crowd below. And this monument was designed on what was called El Monumento, which was a 16th century monument used during Semana Santa in Seville all the way to 1960. And just to underline how important the festival for St. Ferdinand was for the city, we have this to compare it with, which didn't even deserve a print. It was the funerary monument after King Philip IV dies, and they put a little monument up in Seville Cathedral. And I told you this is 134 feet high. Well, these candles are 6 feet high. So the canonization of St. Ferdinand was the most important event of this century. Art was commissioned for the festivities beyond ephemera, such as the life-size sculpture of the saint by Pedro Roldán, and it was painted by Valdés Leal's daughter, Luisa, who was then only 17 years old. And all of this was done between March 2nd, when word reached Seville of the victory, and May 25th. So they had a very short, tight timeline to put together this festivity, but boy, did they. And if you want to learn more about some of these female artists, you should come to the upcoming gallery talk by Professor Zeus next week, next Friday at 12:15 here in the galleries. Because we won't have a lecture here, you should definitely go, so you don't get out of practice for Baroque Spain. And this monument, I should say, this sculpture is processed along with the other important images in the cathedral out at important feasts like Corpus Christi still today, and it's dressed up. Murillo himself was not only called to paint canvases of the saint in 1671, and here we see a portrait of the saint by Murillo in one of the chapels of the cathedral, but he was instrumental in the victory. He had served as an expert witness in preparing the dossier arguing for the saint's canonization that was sent to Rome. You see, in order to build a case for canonization, his proponents in Seville had to prove that his cult was not new, but that it had been around for centuries. And how would they do this? Of course, with images. If you could find images that were over 100 years old, you could prove that the cult to the saint had been alive for over a century. And who can prove that a painting is over 100 years old? Today, you might rely on a connoisseur or curator, but in the 17th century, you would rely on an artist. 2 artists were chosen. Murillo was the younger artist. He was a young man, and the older artist was about 20 years his senior, who we basically don't even know what works were by this artist today. He's been completely lost to history. But Murillo, along with this other artists, went around Seville dating images of the saint and all of this, and he even got to see the corpse of the incorrupt corpse of the saint. And he attested that many of these images were over 100 years old. So besides this being an interesting episode in Murillo's career, why does this matter? Well, I think that it's important to consider that even from the late 1640s, remember he's only just painted that first series that we talked about in the first lecture. He hasn't painted his works for the cathedral, and he certainly hasn't been to Madrid yet. But at this point, he's already thinking about his legacy as an artist, because he would have seen himself in the works that he was analyzing. The images were being used as evidence, and he knew that in 100 years, another artist might be looking at his works not only as an aid for devotion, but as a piece of evidence. And I think that's very important. So here we're looking at a print from the festival book that was based on one of Murillo's portraits, but there are other painted portraits that survive. This small canvas in the Prado shows his approach to the saint as a kind of saintly and prayerful man. He's taken off his crown and scepter and put them aside in order to pray. Then this is perhaps his most famous image of Saint Ferdinand, and it's now in the Cathedral of Seville. And what's interesting here too is Murillo he's participating in the legitimization of the cult by proving that it's old, and part of that is to put this kind of medieval hairstyle on the saint to make the image look older, because as you remember, the older it is, the more legitimate it became. And I don't have any videos for this. I thought that would have been one video too many. But every year, the Feast of San Fernando is still celebrated in Seville. There are long lines to see his body on display in the cathedral, and then also it's followed by a military parade, which I think is quite interesting to think about this Reconquest saint then being celebrated by the military. So I hope you can now better appreciate the role that not only the artist, but the role that the images played in constructing the political and religious climate of Baroque Seville. And I do hope you never look at another Immaculate Conception as a boring Marian, or at least you could hum the pop song in your head while you look at it. So thank you so much. And I would like to invite questions. Yes?
Yes, if Fernando was never canonized, why do we call him a saint?
He was already called San Fernando even before he was not fully canonized. And there was all sorts of, before the Counter-Reformation, there are all sorts of local saints throughout Christendom that are venerated but are not officially canonized. And once the process for canonization became more firmly defined, the church had to kind of let these local cults keep going, because they certainly were not going to have any power to stop them. So it's kind of a local thing if you think about it that way. Thank you. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
Just as a follow-on, I thought that the idea of canonizing